On today's episode, you'll learn how vaccines cost nothing and all healthcare should be run by the government. Property destruction isn't violence, according to a journalist. The US is a failed state because it lets people have their day in court. And lastly, how capitalism values private property over human life, so all protesters can keep smashing windows of black-owned businesses guilt-free. This is Cringe Posts. Hello and welcome on into today's episode. I'm Donald.
And I'm Britt.
And we're going to get started. And of course, we always have to start with our own cringe. So this episode, we've got Britt Espinoza with this classic. Again, a twofer because you do have the Donald Kimball like on it. So a little bonus there.
And my brother, too.
Yeah.
Shout out to Jack.
So you have the holy trinity of cringe here. Biden equals condescending, loud pig. Ryan equals calm, cool, nice guy. Of course, referring to, at the time, vice presidential candidate Joseph Biden and vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan. Now,
go for it.
I was just going to say, I will give you credit. I did not like Biden's performance in the vice presidential debate either. He struck me as very annoying. And that's all the credit I can give you, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I can think of maybe two debates that I can remember in my lifetime after seeing way too many. And this is one of them. The other being, Trump's first one with Hillary, which was, everyone remembers that one. But, I remember specifically Biden being insanely annoying. Mm-hmm. But to assign the terms calm, cool, and nice guy to Paul Ryan is just... that's cringe, man. It's not good.
The thing that strikes me, I think, let's pick an adjective here to break down from each, because it's just so fun. Pig for Biden. I mean, you're not wrong, I guess, but what an odd. It seems more like you're just trying to get him than actually breaking down any particular thing there. Condescending and loud, I get. There were attributes of his performance that pig. I think you're just being like,
I know.
The dumb one. And then Paul Ryan, calm, cool, nice guy. Nice guy. That one I love. In that debate performance, I can definitively tell you that Paul Ryan, he's a nice guy, and that's why you got to vote for him.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. One of my buddies commented on this. You can see there were 16 comments. So back then, 2012, 16 comments was a lot of comments.
Yeah.
But my buddy is like, hey, way to go in furthering political discourse, or calm, cool political discourse, I think is what he said, which was a nice jab. Good work, man. I also I didn't capitalize condescending, but I capitalized calm. Not sure why I did that. But
well, there's a space between one and not the other. Maybe it was a phone post.
True.
I don't know. Actually, I do wonder, was this one that was shown at Northwest? Because I remember there was a debate, and I don't remember if it was a presidential or if it was the vice presidential, but it was shown in the chapel.
Wait, I thought you said my cringe was shown. I was like, what?
No.
I think you're right. I think this was shown.
And so it's very possible you could have been posting this from your phone because of the spacing. That's why one would be maybe capital and the other not. I don't know.
No, you're definitely right. I remember because when I went to go find this, I can't remember who it was, but one of the other students, her and I had had a discussion about the debates because she was pretty big on Biden and Obama. Mm-hmm. And I forgot that they had aired these. Mm-hmm. That's crazy. That's a different time.
Yeah. We watched them all in the in the big chapel on the big screen, and then there was a sort of a panel discussion afterward. But the funny thing is, when you look at it from the perspective of now, Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House for a few years, and he was terrible. I mean, it was not like he's a budget hawk. He's a conservative, but he's okay. No, he was terrible. He did nothing to help any kind of tax cut or at least meaningful tax cut or budget structure. And he single-handedly made the process of the House of Representatives completely broken in terms of allowing bills to be debated and on the floor. He completely consolidated power into the leadership so that any kind of dissenting voices within your party could be snuffed, as former Representative Justin Amash has described in detail. So, Biden, condescending, loud pig. He's responsible for a whole lot of bad, a whole lot of racist policies, a whole lot of policies that killed people. Paul Ryan, terrible and absolutely broke our system, and just one of the corrupt, members of the establishment, just as bad.
Yeah, probably weak, tyrant, and slimy.
Yeah.
would be the three I should have used.
I think that's a pretty good amendment.
I'm cool moving on from this one.
I don't know. Let's maybe focus a little more. No, all right. We'll move on to our quick cringe segment. First up, we've got this one right here, which is, how you go to get the vaccine and no one asks for money and you aren't worried about how much you'll have to pay? Now imagine all healthcare was delivered like that. I can imagine it, and we're broke. And there's a rolling out of basic checkups. You can't get yours unless the government allows you to. It's not on a need basis. There's no specialty. There's no individual care. It's all standardized. Some people died and they have to pull the treatments off the shelf.
I love the faulty premise of you're not worried about how much you'll have to pay, because really what that means is you've already paid, so bummer. Whether you want it or not. Yeah. One of my buddies, he married a gal from up in Canada, and he lived up there for a little bit, and he had a son, and his son busted his arm, and he needed to go in to get an MRI on it to verify that it was broken. It was obviously broken, but he needed to validate it before they could treat it. And they said, hey, it's going to be a 4-month wait for you to get your arm MRI'd. So that's when they decided they were going to move to America for the health care.
Yeah. Well, and our healthcare system is screwed up, but it's not not socialized completely. It's not run by delivered by these vaccines are. I mean, I will tell you, in Washington State, you had to have the sort of you had to be in one of the categories allowed to get a vaccine before the availability was wide enough. And you think about that and you realize that this is something that, at least from a general government standpoint, they want every single person eventually to have, right? That means that this is being mass produced. It had traction to be pre-approved from the FDA, all these sorts of exceptions for this massive global pandemic thing. And even still, it took over a year for me to be eligible to take this thing. Now let's break this down and think about, well, what happens if you're talking about a very specific thing that is not a global pandemic cure? Something that is very tailored to me right now, that takes very specialized services and equipment. How do you think that rollout's going to go? Unless you have some kind of profit incentive for that to be ready, because again, the only reason why we've even have mRNA vaccines ready is because of research and investment that pharmaceuticals put in to make a profit on. And you can argue that the big pharma has gotten tax breaks and been in bed and all that, yada yada. But the bottom line, motivating big pharma even to work on this kind of technology that's allowed it, has been a profit motive. Even if it's being bought through the government, that's the profit. There's not going to be that same kind of incentive created if the government runs every single specialty service, because the government literally cannot afford. I mean, we can't afford this, let alone covering every single healthcare option out there in case any single person needs it. That's why you have specialty people who charge more for services.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting, and I know other people will probably take issue with what you just said, is that, it's profit. People don't realize that profit is not... It's not like some dude sitting in a vault with gold and drinking out of a gold glass and, doing whatever. Profit is what you use to reinvest in future development, right? So if you in this world, with big pharma, where they do all of this stuff out of goodwill, right? Or they just charge cost. They would only ever make one cure, because if they only charge for cost, they wouldn't have anything else to go make another cure, right? And that's what these people don't get. It's and there's a lot of issues with big pharma, right? And how they leverage the monopoly of the government and the gun of the government to make us do certain things. And even with this whole vaccine, it's the biggest honeypot for them to make everyone take it, right? And that's why they're pushing it so much. But regardless, in order for them to make more cures, they have to make a profit so they can invest in more R&D for the next cure, right? Whatever they make from the first cure is what they roll into the second one, and so on and so forth. And you can, obviously debate or argue about how much they should make or whatever. But regardless, you have to make a profit. Any business has to make a profit. Mm-hmm. That's like your lifeline to be able to exist. That's why it's called the blood of business, the lifeblood of business. And no one asks for money. You know how you go to get the vaccine and no one asks for money? It's like, you're right. No one asked for money because they just took it.
Yeah.
They just took it from you.
Yep.
It's crazy,
well,
man.
and as we've mentioned kind of before on this, that when they're doing all of this, when they're running all these vaccines, even still, they've neglected other health costs like cancer screenings and other very preventable, curable diseases. So even though it's not a one-for-one exactly what this person's talking about, you also don't get to ignore the reality that this vaccine rollout, this shutdown, this government-run healthcare initiative has caused so much more harm to existing other medical conditions than it has helped. So, yeah, the vaccine rollout and shutdowns and all of that have been run by the government. And you know what? I will take no government interference. Thank you very much.
Yeah, what is the you and I both rag on him quite a bit, the Ben Shapiro, but he has that thing where he talks about healthcare, and this is true of any service or business product, but you can have two of the three things, right? You can have affordability, quality, or availability, right? Those are the three things you can have in a healthcare system, and you can usually only choose two of them, right? And you have to sacrifice one of the others because it's some sort of, there's scarcity involved in this and price and demand. And I don't necessarily agree with all that. You can argue the semantics of that, but like you look at like LASIK surgery, right, for eyes. Like it's one of the most deregulated medical procedures in the past 20 years, and coincidentally it's also one of the safest, it's also one of the most affordable, and it's also one of the most available, right, because it's deregulated. People are allowed to innovate on it without a lot of regulation, and as a result of that, millions of people are able to see better. Literally where they're doing a procedure where they're taking a laser to your eye and doing crazy stuff to it, they're able to do that safely, affordably, and pretty with a lot of availability. And it's this funny premise that these people have that if the government is involved, it's cheaper. Like that's just not true ever. It's never true. It's cheaper maybe at face value. But sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is the face value. All they see is. I actually don't know what LASIK costs today. I don't know if you have a price off the top of your head for that, but
it's like $3,000.
So they see vaccine equal free, LASIK equal 3,000. That is so much. But what they don't see is the history in the back, and they don't see how much the cost of research and development costs for the vaccines. They don't see how much the taxpayer, money grab that the government did cost per vaccine, and they don't see the decline in cost from LASIK, what it originally was, way up here, all the way down to what it is now. Taking a laser to the eye is way more like $15,000, and it's decreased over the price of the innovation and the affordability. So people see the snapshot of I can walk in and get vaccine free, but LASIK you have to pay $3,000, and they don't understand the full context surrounding it, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no government involved in my healthcare, please. Next post here, we'll move on. All right, and this one's we get a check mark. We get a name because it's a check mark on Twitter.
I know, because she's a public check mark.
Yeah.
Aaron Ross.
Oh man, this one's good. Can we please stop calling property destruction violence in stories about protests? Words are our job, and that is not what the word means. Well, hold on.
Man, words are her job. I just want to look up Webster's
definition
let's
of
see.
Violence. Let's just Google.
I mean, maybe they changed it, dude, because they do that sort of thing.
An act of physical force that causes or is intended to cause harm or damage inflicted by violence can be physical, psychological, or both. Don't think that says.
Oh, this is my favorite one from Webster or Merriam-Webster. The use of physical force to harm someone or to damage property.
There you go. Even still.
Hey, Aaron, you're a journalist. You better go read a dictionary. Words are your job. It's important to know it.
Can we please stop tweeting just facts without looking things up first? Tweets are your job, and that is not what the facts say.
I feel like destruction is probably a synonym for violence.
Yeah.
It definitely is. Because destroy,
Well, and I think what strikes me about this tweet is it belies the creeping redefinition that violence has had over the years, where people will say things like, he used a microaggression, and that was violence on me, and that was literal violence. And it started, I don't know, probably about 8 years ago, maybe 7 is when it started sort of creeping into public discourse. This use of the word violent with things that were not violent. And, you know, even in that definition from Encyclopedia Britannica, it's talking about, you know, physiological violence. And I think that there are arguments to be made that you can inflict mental trauma, and that can be violent. Like shouting in someone's face could be violent, but the creeping redefinition of where it becomes favorable to intersectionalists to have it mean something about power structures rather than its literal definition. In the same way that people will try to argue that racism is only valid when it comes from a position of privilege or power, which is an absurd definition, for the record. They will also argue violence can't happen to property when it comes to a riot because the rioters have an important message and they're destroying property of the bourgeoisie, never mind the small black business owner whose store you just destroyed. And so it's just part of this constant reframing and trying to shift the Overton window of acceptable discourse of what is allowed to be called violent and what isn't.
Yeah, it reminds me. I mean, we've all seen it. The reporter standing in front of the burning buildings and with the highlight of mostly peaceful, right? And it just. I know it's an overused analogy, but the 1984 where they just redefine words. We were always at war with Eurasia. You know, it was never okay to say this word or that word, and it's always meant this. And when literally the last hour it was meant something else. It's horrifying. And, you know, what's so scary is this is the person, you know, she defines it herself. She's like, hey, words are our job. Yeah, your words are your job as the Ministry of Propaganda, right? Yeah. And she's trying to tell us what a word means when it clearly does not mean that. It just really shows you how entrenched, you know, these interests are in the big corporate media and how tied together they and the federal government are. In terms of making their interests move along, and as well as, you know, like you were saying, you know, this critical race theory and Marxist viewpoint of power structures, like how that's just infiltrated and kind of like a mind virus taking over people's brains and made them think crazy thoughts.
And it's interesting that she specifies in stories about protests. It's not enough for her to just say, hey, when we're talking about property destruction, can we not use violence? Words are our job. She specifies in stories about protests. So in her mind, it's agenda driven. It's not about doing your job properly. It's about making sure that the correct narrative is being spread across every journalistic outlet.
Yep.
It's really a shame that these are the people who are supposed to hold the government's feet to the fire. You know?
Yeah, they definitely do not.
No, not at all. Okay, and to our next and last quick cringe, I believe. How do you know the U.S. is a failed state? I'll go first. We're holding a 4-week trial for a murder everybody saw. We're giving due process.
Yeah. This is obviously about Derek Chauvin when they're holding the trial. You know, the U.S. is a failed state. When you usually describe a failed state, most people are talking about like Somalia, where they've got warlords who say, nope, I saw that person do this, so we're going to kill them.
Yeah, I know. This is quite the opposite.
So I don't know, man. If we did what they were saying, I think that would be more accurate of a failed state.
You know, I wonder what there comes to mind for this. Like, what do you think plays out in their world that's not a failed state, where the U.S., everyone sees it and they just say, all right, you're in prison, and throw you in without him having a chance to defend himself? I mean, whether you think Chauvin was guilty or not, and as the verdict came out, he was, you know, charged guilty, and you can argue if that was done fairly, whatever the case may be. The whole point is that everyone has their day in court. Everyone has a chance to defend themselves. Yeah. Otherwise, it just makes me think of in The Dark Knight Rises when the Scarecrow's doing that sort of mock
I know. I thought that too.
Yeah, and there's no real
guilty by banishment.
Yeah, and it's essentially a mob rule where the mob brings someone in and then sends them on their way. And to me, that's what this sounds like. That sounds more failed state to me than than letting people have time for a defense. I don't know.
I don't know. I was thinking about this one because in a lot of ways, right, the U.S., you could describe it from our viewpoint as a failed state. Mm-hmm. The Constitution obviously failed to prevent a parasitic government from taking over, what we've got. And you could maybe argue that the due process aspect of our country might be one of the few good things left in a lot of ways. Yeah. Even if it's not implemented super well, I think that's still a really noble idea that, in principle, we try to still fulfill. Yeah. Whether or not the Chauvin trial was fulfilled fairly, they had the jurors saying, "Yeah, I was scared for my life if I voted guilty." Mm-hmm. But regardless, you got your day in court, right? You got to plead your case. We don't arbitrarily go and it's like these people never read any book about any mob or war chief in history. Mm-hmm. It's like the alternative to due process is unfair tyranny that just kills anyone that it wants. It's might makes right. That's the whole principle we're trying to go against. We're trying to have principles that say, everyone. I can't remember who said it, but they're like the way that we treat the way we treat the worst person in our justice system is how you will be treated, mm-hmm. right? And that's if you were, I can't imagine myself ever murdering someone, right? Like ever. And if I was falsely accused of it, by golly, I hope that I would get due process, right? And if I can't argue for someone that, whether or not, I think what Derek Chauvin did was awful. Obviously, I'm not the biggest fan of police violence. But I saw him put his knee on the guy's neck and all that stuff, and it's like I could definitely see how doing that for 8 minutes, whatever, could kill someone. Regardless of that, even though I think he's awful and I think he's a bad person, I would hope that he would still get the same due process, and I would get the same due process, because at the end of the day, it's the same justice system, right? Any of us can end up in that seat. Yeah. And this person, I think, will have a new definition of what a failed state is when they're sitting in that seat and they don't have due process, right? Yeah. And that's the irony of it all.
Well, and the thing that is, you and I both know the court system and our justice system is screwed up in so many ways. And the way that you choose to critique it is by saying the 4-week trial. Yeah. Like, the oh man, our justice system is so messed up. People get to have a chance to defend themselves. You're like, what? No. Like, no. But it makes me think of a charity organization that I support called International Justice Mission, where all they do, their whole thing, is they go to third world countries that you might be able to more adequately call failed states, and they take on, for free, cases of people who are innocent and wrongfully accused by tyrannical governments of wrongdoing. And I won't forget one of the stories that they told was this example of this guy who comes in, he shoots his gun in the air, and because of that, they weren't allowed to do that, I think. And he goes into a small business. He comes into a small business, shoots his gun in the air because he had a few drinks. Another soldier comes in, asks what's going on, and he drops the gun and says, "Oh, that small business person shot in the air." And they arrest this person on the spot.
Oh my gosh.
This person's taken, and he runs a store, he runs the store and can't feed his family. And he's held in prison for a year, no trial.
Oh my gosh.
And, his wife and kids have to they have to pull them from whatever school they're in. They have to be making money just to survive, just to live. The International Justice Mission takes on the case. Day of court arrives, and there's a power outage. And that meant that they were going to close the book and not do it until he comes up again. Rather than doing it next time, it was like another year. So there is a happy ending. I'm not just telling this to be depressing. I'm just showing what a real failed state looks like. What happens is the International Justice Mission worker was like, "Wait, if you can hold for court for 15 minutes, I will be back." And they ran on foot like a mile to a candle shop, bought every single candle that in this store basically, and ran back, and they lit, and they had court by candle, and he was freed and convicted, for his conviction.
Oh my gosh.
But that is what a failed state looks like. Not having 4 weeks for a murder trial where, we saw it, but we also, not everyone knows the full context of everything.
That's a crazy story, man. Yeah. I'll have to look more into what they're doing. That's really cool. Yeah.
So, all that to say, you're petty. We're holding 4-week trial for a murder that, yes, what Chauvin did was horrible from my perspective. I don't think he did the right thing. I think that it's just a bad scenario. But in the grand scheme of things, you complaining about the U.S. being a failed state comparatively for that aspect versus, stories like this, I think you can probably do better.
Yeah. Wow. You got me with that story, man.
Yeah.
I have to look it up.
Yeah, it's a great organization. But we'll move on to our long cringe. Don't worry, we'll shake you up for this one, because this one's got my blood boiling. 0 people die when a protester shatters a Starbucks window. Tens of thousands die each year because the market denies them health care coverage. The state deems one of these a violent act, the other not. This is because capitalism values private property over human life. And there's a follow-up tweet which we're also going to highlight, but we're in agreement that this second part's a little bit more accurate or a little more of a good take. But I'm still going to read it out just to give credit where it's due, which is, it is 100% legal for U.S. corporations to produce weapons of mass slaughter and sell them to fascist dictators and right-wing paramilitaries all over the world. Our government literally oversees this process. And then they go on about it being illegal for a homeless person stealing a can of beans from a store and whatnot. Now, just to get the easy part out of the way, I think you and I would agree, it's terrible that these weapons are being sold overseas to countries, and all that's facilitated by the government. It's this disgusting private-public partnership where we, not only sell weapons illegally, but we often propitiate the reason those weapons are being sold and create conflicts that will fuel conflicts so that these can get sold. So it's a terrible public-private partnership there, for sure. But moving on to the substance of this, of course, let's talk about when 0 people die when a protester shatters a Starbucks window versus tens of thousands dying each year because our free market healthcare system that we have in the U.S. denies them coverage.
I just want to point out one thing. We agree with this person, right, on the corporations and the government colluding to sell weapons to bad people with this person. But what's funny is this person would advocate that the same people that sell those weapons, the same government, the same mechanism that sells weapons of mass destruction to evil people all around the world is somehow capable of implementing a good healthcare system that benefits the general populace. It's like, I don't know. That's where it's like, yeah, we agree. The government's awful. Why would we want them to handle anything as important as our food or our health care or our energy or anything like that? You wouldn't want that.
Right. Well, and the idea that we have a market that's denying people health coverage is, and that being not violent versus, people shattering a Starbucks window. To me, it's one of those things where how far do you take that line of logic? Because to the point where a healthcare system, again, let's ignore that sort of market language, because you and I both know we do not have a market when it comes to healthcare. We have anything but. We have government subsidies. We have odd laws that tie health insurance costs and coverage to employment, and you have just a complete imbalance of market prices and availability. But regardless of all of that, the idea that the market denying someone health care coverage equals a violent act is not at all the case, because if someone is actively dying, they often can go into a hospital and get treated, and the government covers it, for one thing. But it's the healthcare coverage that's insane. They're saying that by not preemptively promising to take care of some unforeseen action, that is a violent act. Once again, you have that erosion of the word violent, and the erosion of saying violence happens when someone is not actively doing something to proactively help some future possibility. That is not violent act. You can say that it's unfortunate, right? I'd love a world where healthcare systems have the ability to cover every single person. But that's not a reality we live in because of scarcity. And so to say that they deny them coverage as though it's, some poor bleeding out guy coming up to a big guy in a suit and he's, taking away his papers saying, no, I deny you coverage. That's not usually the case. What they're often talking about is, not having the adequate savings or coverage for medical emergencies, which is no one's fault, but it's not a violent act to deny someone healthcare coverage because they're not paying for it. I don't see where the violence comes in.
Yeah, it reminds me of So around here, we've got this big concert venue called the Gorge out in eastern Washington. And they, in the town of Gorge, which is right by the Gorge, I know they sound similar, but they're different. They've got an actual medical clinic. And I remember a couple years back reading about how the medical clinic was in danger of basically going defunct. They needed a bunch more funds because they had to cover anyone that harmed themselves from overdosing on drugs or doing something stupid at some sort of rave at the Gorge, because they had those all the time. They would wander over to the the medical clinic or the hospital, and they were required to give them aid, and then they weren't able to hold them for charges or whatever, and then so they let them go. And so that money costs something, right? It requires money and resources in people's lives, and that's the funny thing, that people conflate property and life. Like, a doctor had to be away from his family, away from things that he loves to do or she loves to do, in a hospital room taking care of this person. And that person's not going to pay for it. And so then therefore it's free or whatever. But that person, it came at a sacrifice of a person's life, literal lifetime. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work, right? And it's the economic law of the free rider problem, mm-hmm. right? If something is free, then people are going to use a lot of it, and they're not going to use it in a way that is most efficient. It's not going to be distributed in the way that is most efficient. And on top of that, because the government is involved with healthcare insurance, I'm thinking personally about, one of my family members that had cancer. He, back in 2010, just trying to be proactive, started paying for long-term disability mm-hmm. insurance from a private company. And I've shared this story with you, but I think it's prevalent to this. And then, once he got cancer in 2017, he was like, hey, I need to, he started receiving some of the social disability stuff that he paid into his whole life, from working with taxes and stuff from the government. And then he went to the insurance company and said, hey, I also want to have my, disability insurance that I've been paying you for be paid out to me. And they basically whipped out their contract and said, nope, look right here. We said because the government pays you a bunch of money, if you're receiving checks from them, we don't have to pay you any of this until you run out of that type of mm-hmm. subsidy. And yeah, that's obviously evil, right? What an awful thing to do. But the incentive to do that wouldn't be there if there wasn't the the big bucket of money that had been taken away from us for people, for them to fall back on, right? And once you interject these outside forces that are, it's almost like playing a game with cheat codes, right? Mm-hmm. But not in a good way, in a way that screws up the mechanics of it all. It makes you break the quest so that you can't actually complete it. The government comes in and they do all these nice things, quote unquote, and it just throws the market for a loop so that efficient solutions can't actually be deployed to people. Yeah. And, in my dad's case, it means it's oh, yep, well, I didn't get to have the, the insurance that I would have liked to have, that I paid for, because, people, the government and, evil insurance people, I agree, the insurance companies are pretty messed up. But they were able to use the social disability as an excuse for that. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. And then to counter this, of course, with the counterexample they bring of this shattering a Starbucks window, and there's 0 people die, and that one is violent and the other isn't. And it's, again, this lack of understanding that people's property is an extension of yourself, right? When you work, and this is coming from people who vehemently argue about how you own your own labor, and how, if you work on something, you have a stake in that thing and you own that thing regardless of the property ownership of it. But these same people then turn around and say that, oh, well, when you shatter a Starbucks window, who cares? Well, it's well, okay, if you don't recognize the property owner, what about the person who built the window or installed the window? What don't they have a stake in it? Isn't that an extension of them to some degree? And again, you take that away, and you look at these protests that happen and this violence that happens. You have decimated lives. You have people who now have to spend saving that they could, these finite resources that are used for things like medical costs that do exist regardless of if you want to recognize them or not. Those costs now have to go into repairing that Starbucks window because you have a stake in that, or your small business that you have to rebuild because it got burned down in a fire that protesters started. So things in the world cost money, and when you destroy property, you are actively taking value out of the economy. You're taking value out of people's lives, and you are actively harming them and making them worse off. You're taking away their capital or their resources, and when, and that capital and resources is what essentially an economy generates and what allows people to go from poverty, go from sickness to health and to wealth and those kinds of things. So the very poorest among us, they're not being wronged by, by the idea of capital. The capital is the very idea that lets them climb up when they're able to save and accumulate through whatever systems. To have that destroyed if they're saving through like a small business or something like that, or that is harming them actively. And so the idea that like it's again shattering a Starbucks window and someone's well-being, the idea that these are disconnected is so far from the truth that you can't have property destruction without people being hurt. That's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and people forget that like dollars are a correlation to amount of labor time, right? Or work expended for something. And so I remember seeing like just by the hard numbers, like I think we could assign like how many lives were harmed or taken away from this. Not like literally taken away, but like just the amount of time.
Yeah.
And it's like I think I saw like $20 billion or something crazy like that in one state of damage, property damage that was destroyed. And it's like, okay, let's average it out. Let's just say generously that that $20 billion was brought to fruition by someone that charges $50 per hour for their labor, and so you divide all that, and if you divide it over, an average person lives about 650,000 hours in their lifetime. Basically by destroying $20 billion worth of value and property that was created, you essentially erased 600 people's whole life's work.
Yeah.
Isn't that nuts?
Yeah.
That's crazy. If they worked from zero, that's not like if they worked from 20 to age 70, right? That's if they worked from cradle to grave every hour of their life, you basically nullified it. It doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
You destroyed that. And people don't, and that's very real. Like you and I've talked about the black bartender, right? That saved up all of his money from being a firefighter to build his bar, and then they burned it all down, right?
Yeah.
And that's the real consequence of it. And so to say that there's no, zero people die, sure, like that's not necessarily true because there were definitely people that died during the protests, but literally hundreds of thousands of people's whole lives' work was erased, and that is truly a tragedy. And it's even a bigger tragedy that it's not recognized. And then to add insult to injury, that it's almost disdained when you kind of point that out.
Right. and it's ironic because the only time that it's still bad, but the only time I'm a little bit more, or maybe less sympathetic with property destruction was like when people are complaining about the January 6th riot at the Capitol, and they're like, the Capitol was desecrated. And I'm like, well, it's annoying because there are taxpayer money that's going to go to destroying it, sure, but that's not like someone's small business. That's not like I think it was what's his name? Oh, the guy on Morning Joe. Joe is it Scarborough or something?
Joe Scarborough.
He goes, I'm not going to pretend to equate this to like the dinky little taco stand on the side. I'm like, yeah, you better not equate those two, because that taco stand or falafel stand or whatever it was is way more valuable than the Capitol, because the little food stand actually is someone providing value rather than sending soldiers overseas to die and kill brown people, and
I forgot about that one.
Yeah,
that was bad.
It's disgusting that he said that, and it shows the complete disconnect. So people get really upset about that property destruction because it's this hallowed, sacred ground, but it doesn't actually provide value in the same way, except it's going to rob the taxpayer. So in that way, it is still bad, and it is still harmful because it's going to rob us taxpayers. But it's not destroying someone's livelihood like destroying a small business or a small stand would. And that to me is
and on top of that, right? Like when those guys broke into the federal government buildings, like they basically have a big pile of money that they can reach into at any time and go fix that. Mm-hmm. The taco stand does not have that, right? Like, hopefully they have some sort of liability insurance that maybe after 6 months of going back and forth with the insurance company, they can actually get, 60% of the value of that taco stand refunded to them. Mm-hmm. But by then their customers have moved on, competition has moved in, maybe they've had to take another job and they're not in a position to reopen it, right? And so the amount of, like, obviously in the federal, in the storming of the Capitol, someone died. So that is very, very tragic. And that does make it a little bit more sad than a taco stand. But just from a pure economic standpoint, like, what a disgusting thing for that guy who's a millionaire that's literally just talks for a living, to look down his nose at someone who makes the tacos to feed him, and then venerates this building that no one that occupies it did anything to build, and was confiscated from common people that work at the taco stand. They took away their income, up to 50% of it, to build it, and then they're going to take more of it to rebuild it. It's just what an elitist, disgusting thing to say. I forgot about that, and you triggered me right there. No more cringe, just trigger there.
Yeah, well, and so that's why I take such issue with the this is because capitalism values private property over human life. No, it's a matter, again, of resource allocation and a matter of livelihoods that are affected by that. You can't live in a society where everything is automatically fixed in a healthcare system for free, and you can't have a society that automatically feeds people for free with no work. There has to be a moving of resources. There has to be allocation, and the market is the best mechanism to let that sort out. So remove the government from healthcare. Let people band together to form associations if they're, let's say that they're, pre-existing condition and they want coverage for a flare-up. It's going to cost them more because they are more at risk, but let them band together, let them lower the cost, let them negotiate directly. And then you will have, things like private property and lives being rightfully valued, because at the end of the day, you can't separate private property. You can't separate resource allocation from human thriving, because they go hand in hand. Because the story of humanity is being able to build, to generate new resources to sustain yourself, to sustain your family, and in capitalism, to sustain your neighbors through your produce and your extra production.
Yeah, I just had to look this up. Like when we're talking about market distribution, like I think maybe some of those nerdy terms might like kind of veil just how important like that is, right? Because like when you like for the federal government, with all the different regulations and stuff that they impose on medical providers and that are a result of them being involved in insurance and stuff, over 2/3 of a doctor's career is spent doing paperwork to satisfy those the paperwork requirements for being a doctor. And I remember, I can't find it right now, it was either 2 million or 20 million, which I know is a big magnitude, but 2 million hours or 20 million hours of labor and office staff is hired each year to deal, on top of those doctors spending their time on the paperwork, to help ease that paperwork and compliance. And it's like, whoa, like we're talking about like maybe we got shorter. Like imagine if you had 2/3 more time of doctors available on the market, what that would do for prices of medical stuff. Like you'd have an excess of supply, right? Because that's really what medical stuff is when you get away from medicine and all that stuff, it's just, okay, how much expertise, how much supply of expertise do we have? And if 2/3 of it's being taken up by doing regulatory compliance, that means there's 2/3 less supply than there could be. And if you have more supply, it's going to be cheaper, right? It's going to be more available. It's going to be better. And so it just shows like it just destroys value. It destroys human effort. It destroys things that people built up and worked to save. And people like it, literally you can assign it the thought that you've destroyed a person's life work when you burn down a building, because that's how much resources and time cumulatively were put into building it. And when you put it in that context, right, for people start to go, oh, okay, I get it. Like, it's kind of horrifying to think that the protest destroyed the equivalent of 1,000 people's life work, right, in a single state. That's that makes you pause and think. It's not just a window in a Starbucks. It's a lifetime of blood, sweat, and tears to make something happen and realize it gone over a day of anger over, and looting. Yeah.
Well, and when this person takes the example of the healthcare coverage being denied, and if they're trying to suppose maybe a government intervention here, which essentially is the government holding a gun to everyone's head and saying you're going to pay for this other person's healthcare, whether you like it or not, I do wonder if they then hold themselves responsible if anyone in the world were to ask them, or any number of the GoFundMe or Kickstarters that exist for some medical procedure, and the fact that this person isn't contributing to every single one of them, or isn't paying for every single one of them? Is he committing violence against those people? Just asking, because at a certain point, even though health coverage and insurance companies right now are raking in dough and have corrupt deals, again, it's through government power and manipulation, but in a idealized sense, what an insurance provider is going to do is, pool people's money, and then when they can pay in, then they're covered if they ever need to take out of that money or whatever, and it's all done voluntarily. And if they are unable to cover someone because they're too expensive for what they're willing to pay in, that is what this person would be deeming violent. And I don't see that as being any different than this person denying anyone else who asks them to help cover the cost of their surgery. At a certain point, you have to recognize, well, I just don't have the resources. And an insurance company can similarly not have the resources. Whether or not you can argue the profit motives or whatnot, that's what the market helps figure out, is profit that makes sense for them, but also keeps costs low so that people do buy in and can afford.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you remove all the government involvement in private insurance, private in quotes, just putting it like you were saying, like in a normal person's thing. If I came to you and I said, "Hey, man, I probably am going to get cancer," and I recently and not even that, because these people want to get rid of what is that, preconditions, or what was that? Pre-existing conditions. Yeah. They want it so that insurance has to cover people whether or not they have pre-existing conditions.
Which makes no sense for insurance, said, hey, by the way. Like, that's the point of insurance.
That's the opposite.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like I come to you and I say, "Hey, dude, I will pay you $5 a month for you to cover anything that goes wrong with me. And by the way, I've already been diagnosed with cancer, and it's going to cost $100,000 over the next year." Sound like a deal? Yeah. Like, no one in their right mind would say that, right? No one would say yes to that. You can't exist. It just logically doesn't work. Like, for one, you're not going to have the money to pay for the treatment, so I'm not going to get it, right? And there's no incentive for you to do it anyways. And that's if you remove the government from it, right? And that's the point of insurance, is you get insurance before you need it. That's
let's change the scenario a little bit. Let's say I'm a multi-billionaire, right? And you do this, and I can afford to do it, right? According to this person, me saying no, I'm not going to do that is a violent act against you. Okay, so I don't want to be violent. I'll take you on. Well, then, shoot. You know someone who also has cancer, and he wants to do the same thing. And so, slowly but surely, everyone comes up to me and does that, and I pay everyone, and then I go bankrupt, and I can't do that anymore. And then you realize that at a certain point, that does become unsustainable unless you make a profit motive for it. And you have to, again, I believe you me, you can argue that there's a lot of wealth in this world, and there is. But if you look at things, especially on a global scale, there is not enough wealth in the concentrated wealthy to take care of every single issue that every single person has. Because once it goes beyond just health costs, then you've lost a lot of the money that would otherwise be going into things like vaccine research, or building homes for the impoverished, or building new technologies that will make food production cheaper. When you take away all of this capital because you don't want to be violenced by this person's definition, you slow human progress so much. And yeah, those people might be covered in that sense, but then they're also going to be much worse off in the long term when your entire society and economy goes down and you don't have basic things like toilet paper anymore.
Yeah. It makes me think of when Bernie was proposing that, I can't remember, I think it was like $3 trillion bill, or maybe it was $30 trillion bill for healthcare, and you go look at like the market caps of the biggest companies. Like, let's say you totally sold all of Google, and you sold all of Apple and Facebook and all these companies. Like, you might be able to pay for a quarter of a year of his plan. Right, if you just totally everything that they own, every revenue that they took in, every store, every component that they've sourced and infrastructure they built up, if you just took it and you sold it to whoever would buy it, no one would, because you have to have other stuff to run it. Like, it would only pay for a quarter of that, and that just shows you how unrealistic this kind of system is. The only way that things can get better and cheaper is if you innovate and you create new. I really like your free markets destroy. It's destroy, what was it? Destroy,
disease,
innovate, repeat.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah, something like that, and that's what it is, right? I remember you actually gave this example. The people that benefited the most from indoor plumbing and toilets was not the ultra wealthy. They already had servants that took out the chamber pots. Mm-hmm. It was the middle class and the poor, right? Because now they had access to clean, sanitized, disposal of their bodily functions mm-hmm. That they previously wouldn't have had otherwise, right? And so that's the rich are always going to have more than other people and have a better standard of lifestyle, but a person, I really enjoy this on my shampoo when I get in the shower because they have it on the back and it says, "You smell better than, every king that has ever lived in history," yeah. Right? I'm like, like they're right. When I use this shampoo and this body wash, like I smell way better than every king in history mm-hmm. and that has ever existed. And that's what's so cool about market innovation, right? Like even the poorest of us in the United States, at least, like generally, we've got fat people, right? Like fat people in the United States, people that eat too much because there's too much food, around, and it might not be good food, right? And that's usually what the case is. But we're one of the only countries that has that, and that's kind of. I know we're kind of getting off on a tangent, but that's the beauty of. Despite its best efforts, the government can't totally tamper down on the free market, and it will innovate and make life better for other people. Mm-hmm. It's just unfortunate that in some of the really key areas like healthcare. It's not allowed to do that.
Yeah. Again, and what free market capitalism recognizes is that everything is resources. Everything is about that distribution and making sure that costs stay low and people can find that middle ground between profit and affordable. Right? People think that again, that like there's this idea of the man in the suit denying people coverage because he's rich and is I just don't want to make a profit, or you're not giving me enough money. And that's really only the case when the government gets involved and can price fix, because if what they do isn't sustainable on a profit level that's reasonable to keep them in the game, but also cheap enough for people to come, then they don't have a model at all. And that's all of what the market balance is what people can pay and what people can get in order to keep that going. You have to create sustainable futures for the people who are providing services as well as the people who are buying those services. So profit is necessary, but unless the government comes in and price fixes or somehow ruins the conversation between the buyer and the seller, you don't actually usually end up with that huge disparity of paying so much and this one person getting all that money.
Yeah. Yeah, it's economics is a science just as much as any other, hard science like physics. And there are laws and things that you can predict just simply based on certain inputs and outputs, right? And a lot of people forget that. If you don't have an excess at the end of some sort of business cycle, that business is going to go under because they don't have enough to continue it forward. And you have to have profit motive. And it's not like a Gordon Gekko where it's like greed is good, like that's not what we mean by profit. Profit is the amount that in excess that enables you to continue on into a new, season or cycle of your business. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have that, there is no business. Yeah. There is no more healthcare. There is no more innovation on a vaccine. There's no more innovation on new drugs. They have to make at least one more dollar than they've put out in order to continue on.
To put it in very simple terms, you can think of it as if you have a cow and they produce three gallons of milk every day and it costs 2 gallons to feed that cow, you need that 1 gallon of milk to be able to save up so that you can buy food and so that you can eventually buy a new cow when that cow dies, because the cow is going to die even if you keep feeding it with with the cost of 2 gallons of milk. So you need that 3rd gallon of milk to be profit. Otherwise you have those 2 gallons that you just sell enough to maybe feed the cow and it can keep producing 2 every day, and then it dies and then there's no more milk total. Yep. So profit is the only thing that keeps things sustaining, and ideally when there's no government involvement in healthcare, you end up with the right balance between it being affordable and enough profit to keep it sustainable. And when you have things like protesters shattering windows for small businesses, you eat directly into that. And oftentimes, places that are barely, if at all, making a profit are the ones that are getting hurt. Yep. So,
I don't got anything else on this one.
Yeah, I think we've exhausted that quite a bit. But that one is just a really it's a really deceptive take that I think a lot of people will see and maybe get that gut feeling like this is wrong, but not exactly articulate why. And there's just a lot of false assumptions in it that I think should be addressed. So that being said, we are at the end of this episode, so make sure to call us out on anything we said this episode that made you cringe on our socials. So check out cringeposts.com or cringepostpod on Twitter and Instagram, and check out our locals as well. Thank you so much for being with us on this episode.